Since his wife had passed away 5 years earlier, Brian lived alone. He couldn't bear to leave the home they had built together. It was located near the glorious Montana wilderness. Every morning, Brian would fill his flask with hot coffee, sling his camera over his shoulder and binoculars around his neck, and set off to explore. It was a way of keeping him occupied. It was something he did with his wife for many years, and there was no way he was going to stop enjoying the outdoors now that she was gone. It made him feel close to her. One spring morning, when Brian stepped outside, he had barely ventured outside his backyard and into the woods beyond when he spotted something lying on the ground. It was a baby red squirrel. Brian immediately knelt down to investigate. He was shocked to see that it was still alive. It was tiny. He guessed that it was around 2 months old and likely still relied on its mother's milk. Its back right leg was hanging off at the ankle. It had scratches all over it and what looked like a puncture wound in its side. Brian picked it up in his hands and looked around. The squirrel barely moved. He didn't have the heart to put it out of its misery. Still holding it gently in the palm of his hands, he looked up at the surrounding trees for a squirrel dray or nest. He couldn't see one. He contemplated setting the tiny animal down in some undergrowth and leaving it alone, but instead felt compelled to help it. He carried it back through the woods, across his yard and into his house. He grabbed a roll of kitchen towel and, whilst holding the baby squirrel in one hand, tore off strips of towel with the other. He then emptied his fruit bowl and placed the shredded kitchen towel inside to form a kind of nest. Gently, he placed the baby squirrel inside. Its breathing appeared to be shallow. Its eyes were glazed over. Brian thought it was dead at one point, but then he noticed its nose twitch. He rushed to the medicine cabinet and found a small syringe. He sucked up some warm water from the tap and squeezed a droplet out onto the squirrel's closed mouth. It lapped it up. Brian repeated this process again and again until the syringe was empty. He then refilled the syringe and offered more water. For 10 minutes, the little squirrel continued to lick the droplets of water from the end of the syringe. Brian then chopped up an apple and placed a slice next to the squirrel. It turned its head away and closed its eyes. When the squirrel was asleep, Brian sprayed some antiseptic spray onto its wounds. He wrapped the back leg with a bandage and left it to rest. It was clearly very nearly dead. No normal, healthy squirrel would let a human do that to them. Throughout the day, Brian checked on the baby squirrel. When its eyes were open, he offered it water and nudged the apple slice closer. But when evening came, there hadn't been much improvement. Brian guessed that it had been attacked by a cat, weasel, or raccoon, or maybe even a bird of prey. Whilst the squirrel slept, he scoured the trees just outside the back of his yard to see if there were any signs of the nest or any other injured squirrels, but he didn't see anything. It could have been carried a long way from its nest, so he didn't hold out much hope of finding the rest of its family. When he went to bed that night, he didn't expect the baby squirrel to make it through to morning, but he knew he had tried his best. When he walked into the kitchen at first daylight, he couldn't believe his eyes. The squirrel was still alive. It lifted its head when Brian walked into the room, and what's more, the apple slice had been almost completely eaten. Only the skin remained next to the squirrel. The squirrel had made a miraculous U-turn. Brian was so happy that it was still alive. He filled the syringe and gave it some water once more. Then he left it a pile of apple slices. The squirrel got to its feet. It couldn't put any weight on its back right leg, but to see it standing was a relief and a massive improvement on the day before. Over the next few days, Brian watched in amazement as his new little friend grew stronger and stronger every day. He bought the squirrel a whole range of fruits, vegetables, and seeds to eat, and placed a small dish of water next to its kitchen towel nest. Within a couple of weeks, the squirrel was moving around Brian's kitchen. When he went to bed each night, he had to make sure the kitchen door was securely closed, otherwise it would run all throughout the house. If Brian held out his hand, the little squirrel would tentatively step onto it and he could stroke it gently. He occasionally took it outside for some fresh air, but he didn't let it go. He knew that it belonged outside, but he wanted to hold on to it a bit longer, to give it the best chance of making it alone. He was determined to fatten it up before sending it on its way. Brian sometimes sat in front of the television, and the squirrel would join him. He would sit with a handful of nuts, and the squirrel would pick the nuts out of his palm and either eat them right there or would try and bury them, usually under one of the couch cushions. Sometimes Brian would find a small pile of seeds and nuts in the most unusual of places. Once they were hidden inside the tube of the toilet paper roll. But Brian was acutely aware that the longer the squirrel stayed with him, the harder it would be for it to return to the wild. The bandage had come off, and although the skin had healed, the damaged foot hadn't. It was bent at an odd angle, and the squirrel had to keep it off the ground when walking about. Finally, the day came when Brian believed the squirrel was strong enough and big enough to venture out into the big wide world. He picked it up and took it back across his yard and into the woods. He knelt down and held out his cupped hands. When he opened them, the squirrel immediately jumped down onto the ground without so much as a glance over its shoulder. Brian smiled as he watched the little animal scuttle off and disappear amongst the trees. He placed a handful of seeds on one of his fence posts in case the squirrel came back for food. That became a daily ritual, leaving a small handful of seeds out in case his little friend ever went hungry. Brian didn't expect to see the squirrel again. He hoped it was off living the life it deserved. But less than a year later, he was in for a shock. One of his gutters was blocked. The rain poured over the edge and onto his driveway below. Brian hauled his stepladder out of the garage and climbed up to take a look. He fully expected to find it filled with leaves, but he came across something else instead. It was a nest, but this wasn't any nest, it was a squirrel dray. Brian shook his head, thinking to himself that he must have some sort of a squirrel connection. First the injured one and now this nest. When he peered into the nest, he was surprised that there were already babies inside, but he was in for an even bigger surprise. Scurrying down the edge of his roof was the mother squirrel. She had a mouthful of seeds, and that's not all. Brian noticed that she had a limp. He noticed that her back right leg was twisted as an odd angle and lifted off the ground when she moved. This was the squirrel he had saved. She was back, and she had decided to rear her own young on Brian's property. It wasn't the best place for a nest, half hanging over the edge of the gutter and half wedged into a vent. But Brian's heart felt like it would melt. He couldn't believe that the little squirrel had come back, and that she hadn't just survived in the big wide world. She had thrived. The same time last year, Brian had contemplated leaving her in the undergrowth and letting nature take its course. He felt sure that she wouldn't have survived if he had done that. Now, his act of kindness had produced 3 new lives, a whole new generation. And that was something that Brian would never forget, nor would the squirrel.